Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is John Decker and we're doing another project. Now the last time I was on camera, I was doing the workbench and sitting on the floor. It's a little too cold to sit on the floor today, but I mentioned at the end of the last video that I was going to have to do another workbench, and that is what today's video is about. I want to be clear up front, there are a couple things. One, we will not be doing drawers. I kind of alluded to how the drawers were made in the previous video. This workbench is going to have a different configuration underneath, and I'll do that later. Today it's just about making the bench and the tabletop itself. And about that tabletop, I happen to have on hand a piece of 8-foot long butcher block rubber wood countertop from 4 or 5 years ago that I bought from a call pack, primarily because it had surface damage. That's probably not something everyone has available to them. And I did have it cut down, or rather I cut it down to 2 4-foot lengths in order to do these 2 workbench tabletops side by side for easier maneuverability later on. I wanted to clear that up because what I will be showing you is how you could make the same exact workbench that I'm making. I'm going to tell you the measurements, I'm going to show you the techniques, for lack of a better term, that I used. And I am not a woodworker, so some of this is something that I've learned literally just by doing it. And so that should be interesting. I also want to be really clear up front. I use a chop saw and I use a table saw. And a lot of people think of that as being more tools than most people would own. But if you have a workshop like this, the likelihood is high that you'll have those tools at your disposal. They do not need to be the ones that I use. You can use any chop saw to do what I did. There was nothing special about it. And the table saw that I have, it's like a 30-year-old Craftsman table saw. Actually, I think it's Ryobi table saw from back when Ryobi was blue. So to kind of give you some context for that one. But this is just something that I wanted to bring up at the very beginning of this. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more DIY projects of this nature. And we're going to go ahead and get right into it today. First, I took a piece of butcher block countertop that was cut to 24 inches wide by 48 inches long and laid it on the floor with the top facing down. In this position, I marked a line at 2.5 inches in from the edges to act as a guide for placing the rest of those parts. Then I chose some 2x6 offcuts from the scrap wood pile. I set my table saw fence to rip those boards into 2.5-inch widths and process them into 4 lengths of 43 inches and 4 lengths of 18.5 inches. I cut a 3/4 inch deep lap joint at the ends of the 43-inch boards that matches the width of the 2x4 material. That's the process I'm doing here. The 18.5-inch board will butt up into this lap joint, and that'll help the parts sit squarely and tightly together when they're glued. These parts will be combined to make the table skirt. That's the frame that sits under a traditional tabletop to connect the legs to. These parts will also be used to make the frame near the bottom of the legs, called the stretcher. The stretcher keeps the legs from spreading or moving in unwanted directions. In this project, both the skirt and the stretcher are assembled with the same process and shaped identical to each other to make the processing of their parts more efficient for me. The long boards and the short boards are glued and screwed together squarely to make the skirt and the stretcher, respectively. I used the alignment marks drawn on earlier to place the skirt frame. Then I marked and drilled holes, basically running 3-inch decking screws through the skirt and into the tabletop, joining the 2 parts together like a traditional table. The table-like design allows me some configuration and use options if I ever choose to position this workbench somewhere other than against a wall. For now, it provides a small gap behind the workbench for cable management or storing poles. Next up, I chose 2 4x4 posts from the cull pile to be the legs. I made sure that even though they were split on one face all the way down to the core, called the pith, that the posts weren't twisted. I cut the 4x4 posts into 4 40-inch lengths to be the legs of the workbench. I wanted the legs to be attached to the outside of the skirt because it would make more space on the inside for building drawers or further down the line, maybe cabinets. I used an offcut from the skirt frame to mark the cut position in the legs. I also used that same piece of wood as a guide to set the depth and width of the lap joint I needed to cut in the top of each leg. I made sure that the lap joints were cut in the sides of the legs that had the split in it. This was both to hide the split by facing it inward and also to make sure that my lag screws wouldn't split the wood further during assembly. The process that I'm demonstrating here to cut these joints requires a lot of grip strength in your thumbs to hold a 4x4 post against the basic miter gauge. I only mention that because there are probably a lot of reasons not to use your table saw blade to sand down the inside of the lap joints like I do in this video. However, I don't own a set of woodworking chisels, so this is how I've always made this type of joint for projects. The stretcher is cut to 4 inches from the bottom of the leg post. This provides a place for me to put my feet when I'm standing right up to the working surface. If you choose to do your jointing like I'm doing here, it's best to cut both sides of the joint using the rip fence as a guide, and then do the cuts inside the line to avoid misalignment in the cut and avoid bouncing off the blade. With practice, this feels normal and goes pretty quick for basic joints such as these. Now I took the legs back to the project and set them in place to make sure everything lined up. Then I began drilling the holes for the lag screws to screw in from the outside. This look isn't for everyone, but it makes disassembly far easier if I ever need to break these down in the future. I used one 3-inch leg screw and one 6-inch leg screw per leg, with the 6-inch screw driven into the center of the front or rear skirt frame board and the shorter lag screw driven into the side of the skirt board. I'm using an impact driver here, and it tightened things right up. Now to make the assembly easy, I attached the legs on one side of the table first, then placed the stretcher frame into the slots cut in the legs. I attached the stretcher with lag screws using the same procedure as the skirt. This works to hold the stretcher in place during assembly because of how solid this type of joint is. I then attached the legs to the other end of the bench using the exact same process. Now, because the floor of my workshop is old, warped, sloped, and uneven, I needed to add feet to these legs. You can skip this step if you have a flat floor. I drilled a 1/2-inch diameter holes 3 inches deep into the center of the bottom of the legs and attached heavy-duty adjustable furniture feet to the legs. This will allow me to level the workbench without having to tear out and level the floor yet or change the leg lengths for a custom fit. I wanted to play Aju Sprach Zarathustra theme here, but I don't play any brass instruments, so you'll just have to imagine epic obelisk introduction music, I suppose. Having those furniture feet is handy, and it allows me to level the workbench top to match the existing workbench from last week. The 2 workbenches are made from the same butcher block slab, and the patterning aligns at the seam. Now this table is heavy and sturdy, but I plan on using it for a lot of hammering and sawing motions and wanted it to be extra stable even if the floor wasn't. My next step was to pick out more material scraps from the pile that were long enough to be X stretchers that I wanted to make for the back and sides of the workbench. I like using X's like this because it's easier for me to understand how they work to send load from one connection to the other, and it helps me visualize the strength they add to counteract that sawing and shaking motion when doing projects on the workbench. I made the X stretchers to affix directly to the legs. I measured the angle without needing to know the number by placing a long piece of the X stretcher to the position I wanted it on the outside of the legs, and then marking it with a pencil from the inside. Once I had that angle set, all of the boards for the stretcher would use the same angle at the ends. I set one leg of the X stretchers into place and temporarily placed the alternating leg to measure the position and angle of the crossing joint in the middle. The thickness of the upright legs on this table provided space to measure the angle this way without needing to do precise measuring using any tools. I was able to mark the position for the lap joint directly onto the stretcher boards to make that cut. So what we're doing here is we're sneaking up on the middle. So in theory, we can mark this and say, okay, this is where The middle is there. If I flipped it over though, snuck it in, you'll see it's off by a little bit. And so you could mark it and try to guess and then take it and waste material, or you can just sneak up on it and make a mark that's accurate. Essentially setting this at the right level. So we're going to do it right now. You can see that's like right in the middle. So then how to create the angle. So I marked the angle. How do you find the angle? Well, that's where this generic thing comes in, and it marks all the angles, but just loosen it up, stick it on your piece. You can stick it on your piece however you like. And then you're trying to basically mimic that edge. This and line it up. Make sure that your line is right there, nice and flush. And then slide it down, make sure both lines match. I did not glue the joint when assembling the X stretcher because this wood is going to swell and shrink over the seasons up here in the north, and we're currently in its most shrunken phase. I used the same process for the X stretchers on the sides and opted to make the stretcher only in the upper third of the leg space there. I used that same process to find and cut the angles and joint. In this case, however, I made the measurements such that the stretcher ends were 45-degree angles and the lap joint in the middle was just a straight 90. Once the stretchers were screwed into place, the workbench was structurally solid. And so there it is. We have the tabletop put together with legs and the structure. Learned a little bit about stretchers and skirts and all sorts of fun stuff here. These are things that I've literally learned in the last week, so I'm glad to be able to at least put them on camera and maybe somebody else can learn from them rather than having to stumble around like I did. Guys, for those of you out there, whether you're from Arizona or California or Turkey, I had some guy respond back from that. I appreciate every one of you who have subscribed in the past couple months. It's really helped the channel grow, and it's also helped me feel like I really want to continue making these project videos and putting them out there for you to see. Let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts about the project today. And I've got one quick note before I sign off. I did find while working in on the project here off camera, I was digging through the scrap pile and found a couple of these. Now, if you don't know what this is the gearing mechanism from inside of a tabletop when you have leaves in your tabletop and it kind of expands out and allows you to put more leaves in there. I don't know what to use it for, and I'm hesitant to get rid of things like this because it's neat. So if you have any ideas for what to use something like this for in a workshop, let me know. I'm open to suggestions. All right, I think that's all for now. I'm gonna go ahead and put on my hat because it got chilly out here as I let the fire out while I was working on the workbench. Oh, one quick note before I totally sign off for the night. In a previous video about the previous workbench, the one with the drawers in it, I had someone comment that in order to make the drawer slides function more smoothly, it would be a good idea to put beeswax on them. And I do agree with that, and I may do it for the rest of them. But since I have one drawer that I use more frequently than others, the way that it's set up right now, I didn't have any beeswax on hand, and I didn't have any canola wax or anything really waxy on hand. So while talking to my dad on the phone the other day, was chatting with him, and he mentioned using silicone spray. He also watches the channel. Hi, Dad. And so I did. I used the silicone spray on the one drawer that I use most frequently, and it works a charm. So thank you for that suggestion. And for those of you who want me to use beeswax, it probably will happen just later when I have a chance to, get out there and get stuff. All right, that is all for now. I think I covered everything. I'll see you next time. Bye.